Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I am so very excited to welcome to this week's show Julie Lowell, who is the Economic Security Policy and Outreach Director for the Public Assets Institute based in Montpelier. And we will be talking today about the annual State of Working Vermont report. And this one will be for 2025, the year that was quite the year, I think. So welcome, Julie. So glad to have you here.
Thanks, Olga. I'm really happy to join you.
Well, I would love to start. We've had folks from the Public Assets Institute on the show before, and I do try to make a point of talking about, and for the video watchers, I will hold it up, the State of Working Vermont report. Um, but I would love if we could take just a couple minutes and frame this for listeners. Why does the Public Assets Institute do this report? What are you hoping Vermonters will gain from it
Yeah,
as they go through into the new year?
yeah, that's excellent. I'm happy to do that. We have been doing this report, Public Assets Institute, for 20 years now
Oh
or
my
so.
gosh.
So I have not been doing it for all of those 20 years, but I've been doing it for a number. So every year we put this report out to really tie what the economy means to Vermonters' real lives, right? We often hear about the economy in really broad brushstrokes of economic indicators, and this report dives deeply into how that impacts a Vermonter's day-to-day ability to meet their basic needs. And so we kind of have it's evolved over years from kind of a very wonky white paper that people could take hours to read through to a pretty compelling and bright chart book where people can look at a page individually and kind of see what's happening with homelessness in their community and just look at that page. But in its entirety, what we really strive to do is tell a story of how the economy is impacting the everyday Vermonter. And so over the years, we've used a lot of different resources, but this is all anchored in data from the American Community Survey, which is a federal survey that has state data available. And because of that, there's a bit of a lag. So that data from 2024 comes out in September, or from the year before, right, comes out in September. So in September, we got the 2024 data. So a lot of this report comes from 2024, but then we supplement it with labor force indicators that are monthly so that we can have more recent information, and then also administrative data. So kind of pulls together a number of different pieces to try to really help Vermonters understand what's happening in their community and tie their own experiences to what's happening in the economy.
Thank you for that summary, Julie. Yeah, I often I think one reason on a personal level I appreciate this report is a few things. Vermont, I feel sometimes can be a little tough for data because we're so small. It doesn't take much for the data to swing because we're such a small sample size. But also, I often feel like I'll look at the news and they'll be saying, "Oh, the economy's doing this, the economy's doing that," and I'll look at my everyday life, like you said, and think, "So what am I doing wrong?"
You're
And this,
not doing anything wrong. I
this,
want you to feel that, Olga, by the time we finish this conversation, nor is anyone else, right? Like we're all in a system that
Mhm.
is, frankly, difficult to make ends meet. And so I think that's a real takeaway that if we can give people recognizing that everybody's working hard and doing their best, um, and we're in a space right now where prices and wages continue to grow apart from one another, and life is getting more expensive. And I think that is, when I was in my kind of early adulthood, I remember people saying, "Oh, housing is so expensive." And now I'm in a place where my younger colleagues are saying, "Oh, housing is so expensive." And so it is really important to tie it to data. Yes, it was true when I was a young adult that housing was expensive, but what we can see in the data is um, that housing is getting more expensive, and the experience of younger adults now is very different from what it was when I was a young adult. And so, like you said, it's so important to tie it to the data to really understand um, some of these anecdotal experiences, which are absolutely valid, but what does that mean in a more comparative way?
Mhm. Before we dive in any further, I just want listeners, and if you're watching the video version, to know that you can download this report if you go to the Public Assets Institute website. They have a section called Reports, and everything they've published there. I will also put it in the show notes to the podcast version of this show that you can find on our Captivate channel. And yes, once again, for video listeners, there's the cover. So if you want to follow along, you can do that. One thing I found interesting, I want to hear what you found, your findings, in a minute, Julie. But I think what I found interesting is, 2025 felt like such a year of upheaval. And that is to a certain extent reflected in this report. But it also felt like many of the issues Vermont is struggling with are still there. The housing, the healthcare, the wages. So in some ways, it was like 2025 was different but the same. I'm wondering, was that kind of your feeling as well?
Yeah, it was definitely a kind of a report where we reflected a little bit on where are we now compared to the pandemic. And we think we're kind of at our new baseline, right? We found in the report that we've mostly recovered. Our labor force has mostly recovered from the pandemic. Things are sort of back to normal. And what we saw during the pandemic was some of those kind of perpetual problems that associated with poverty and the challenges of housing and healthcare and food costs, right? They were tempered a little bit because we saw really good government investment during the pandemic, which helped people make ends meet. And since then, that support has fallen away. And so all those entrenchable problems, they're still there. And so, yes, there's a kind of a similar story. And then with federal cuts and uncertainty, we're seeing those problems just continue to be exacerbated now. And so I think we've turned the corner from the pandemic. We've seen how state investment can really help people and help them make ends meet and make life easier. And now we're in a totally different space where the pandemic, I think, is in the rearview mirror. And we're seeing the negative impacts of the uncertainty of when we pull those funds back, those really important public investment funds back.
Interesting. So for you, what were some of the key highlights or takeaways that you think, if Vermonters took anything away from the report, you'd like them to really look at these whatever key highlights I'll say?
Yeah, so one of the things I'm really excited about is a new analysis, and I'm going to get a little wonky and dirty for a
Go
few minutes,
for it.
Olga, if that's okay. All right. So often we hear about the number of Vermonters living in poverty, and it's 9% of Vermonters. It's almost 60,000 Vermonters living in poverty. But for those of you who kind of dive into the nerdiness of what that poverty threshold is, it's inadequate. So a family of four making $35,000 a year is not considered living in poverty based on those poverty thresholds. So we were able to take some time this year and really dig into a deeper method of how many families in Vermont are really making ends meet. So the Joint Fiscal Office, an arm of the legislature, the research arm of the legislature, every 2 years they do a deep dive into this basic needs budget methodology. And they look at kind of 6 or 7 different sample families. And they look really specifically at Vermont costs and what it takes for a family to get by, what housing costs are, food costs, healthcare, childcare, transportation, savings, et cetera. And they produce estimates of what a family needs to get by. And those estimates range from $44,000 to an individual in the state to just under $100,000 for a family of 4, 2 adults and 2 kids. And so we were able to take those thresholds and we were able to expand them and add 11 different families. And so overall, we did this analysis and it accounts for 74% of Vermonters in our analysis. And what we found is a staggering number of households who aren't making ends meet. And so I'm going to look at my notes for this one because I constantly am. I think it's really important that we get this right. So half of single adults and a third of families without kids are not meeting those basic income thresholds. And the way that we got at that is we took this American Community Survey data and we looked at self-reported incomes on that. And then we were able to tie that data to the thresholds. And so really specifically look at these numbers. And this is just incredibly concerning, right? Half of single adults are not meeting that threshold. Now, it doesn't mean they might not be meeting their basic needs in other ways. Um, they might have found a really good deal on rent. They might be able to access Three Squares Vermont for their family. There might be other ways they're meeting their basic needs, but for these families under the threshold, there's a lot of stress there. What if that really good deal on rent goes away? What if that landlord sells the building, right? There's just these families are lacking kind of that flexibility to deal with a crisis, or just to kind of have the choice and opportunity that they might want. And so this kind of really stood out to me. I was really excited we were able to make the push to get this analysis done. And I think it's really compelling to show that Vermont really needs to do more on both the cost and the wage side of things so that families are able, so that all of our families, right, can be meeting those thresholds and then some.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I reached that graph yeah, in the report, I have to say it was a real eye opener for me. And folks, I will also link to the JFO's basic needs budget in the show notes because I think that's always an interesting read as well. And yeah, I guess, it left me with the question though is, you know, people people figure things out. And they're making it work, but as you said, there's a lot of stress there. There's a lot of uncertainty, like you said, if the landlord decides to sell the building, or as the analogy, get a flat tire, and now you can't get to work, and then snowball from there. What does it mean for a state's overall economy to have that many people struggling?
Yeah, I think we really see these ripple effects everywhere, right? You get the flat tire, you don't get to work. You don't get to work, your employer's struggling to fill that gap. Your community members that are depending on that business are filling that gap, right? So we kind of have these ripple effects of stress that come out into our community when people aren't able to meet their basic needs. And so, I think with kind of the federal impacts, we know it's going to be even harder in 2026. We've got a tax on our Three Squares Vermont program and on Medicaid, which mean that there's going to be increased administrative burden on people. And so that's going to be more difficult for them to access benefits, another layer of stress they have to encounter. And we're also seeing our neighbors who are immigrants being kicked off of these programs and no longer qualify. And we're seeing benefits reduced. So it's just kind of compounding the levels of stress that families are facing. And again, as I said, those ripple effects that our community is facing. So, I think the flip side is, and which again, we've learned from the pandemic, strengthening public investment in these programs, which our state still does have the opportunity to do. I don't want to be all doom and gloom. We still have the opportunity to strengthen some of these programs and to make that choice so that our community is not struggling. And we've seen lawmakers step up to do that over the last year, and that's pretty heartening, right? During the federal shutdown in October, 60,000 Vermonters were just playing a wait and see game around their Three Squares Vermont benefits, which is not a game you want to play with food. And lawmakers stepped up to make sure that those families had resources to pay for their monthly food bills. Mm-hmm. So I do think that there's really we know what the solutions are. And so I think that is encouraging.
Mm-hmm. Just for the sake of listeners, I think sometimes when we use these numbers like 60,000 Vermonters, it can be a little hard to kind of get your heads around. It's like, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a lot, sort of like, how do we wrestle with that? So just a reminder that 60,000 people, there's a lot of counties in Vermont, counties that don't have that many people in them. That's a larger portion than many counties have for population. So just kind of, I don't know if that helps people make them a little more real.
Yeah. And that, is about 10% of the population, if that helps people 60,000 sounds like a lot to me. And then when you compare to other states, you're like, oh, that's we can get our hands around that. We can address this.
Hmm. I think that's a very good point. Yeah, there's a lot that we can do because we are a smaller state. Any other findings you want to highlight?
Um, I think, I just think on one of the big takeaways, we really looked at sort of cost and wages. And in terms of cost, we're just seeing that healthcare and housing continue to drive a lot of stress for a lot of families. Um, in terms of healthcare, I don't think I have a conversation with anyone in my life, whether it's professionally or personally, who isn't struggling with access and affordability of care. And in particular, we know folks on Medicaid, like as I'd already mentioned, might face some cuts. But there's 30,000 Vermonters that get health care through the public marketplace exchange.
Hmm.
And that's supported by federal investment. That's $350 billion that helps that care, that health insurance be affordable for folks. And we are facing the likely loss of $65 million of that care or of those tax credits, which help people afford health insurance. And so middle income families, again, are going to be pretty poorly hit by that. An individual making $63,000 a year could be facing premiums of $15,000 a year now,
Mm.
with the kind of the standard benchmark premium. There is the possibility that there's cheaper care and premiums that are cheaper insurance they could buy, but then their out-of-pocket costs will increase. And so just that benchmark plan will cost them a quarter of their income. So
Mm.
healthcare is kind of continues to be, I think, a really important piece of the conversation that we need to be addressing. I think it's all of us are finding it quite unaffordable and difficult to access. And then housing continues to be another one that and what was really striking in this report is the growth of housing values in the last 5 years. So we
Yeah.
looked at from the pre-pandemic in 2019 to 2024, home values grew by $120,000 in that 5-year period. So the median home price is now $353,000 in 2024. And when you compare that growth, 120, I just want to make sure I'm getting it right, 120, yeah, $120,000 growth over 5 years on the value of homes. In the 5 years previous, it only grew by $18,000. So really puts it starkly, I think, about how the cost of housing really continues to be out of reach for people.
Hmm.
So those were kind of the big takeaways on the cost side for us, is just how difficult housing and healthcare continue to be. And on the wage side, we're just continuing to see growing inequity. While we've seen wages grow for those at the bottom, the level of wage growth is just a third of what it's grown for those at the top. So over, I believe it was a decade, right? Those at the top earners gained about $18,000 in income over that time period. And those at the bottom gained about a third of that, around $6,000. So we're just continuing to see this growing inequality in our communities.
Hmm. And I think that's worth noting because if I remember um, my economic history properly, there was a long time in Vermont's history where our economic inequality was actually a much smaller gap compared to a lot of other places in the US. But so this like growing inequality is somewhat newish for Vermont. And
Yeah.
I find that kind of interesting and concerning at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't say it's newish, but it's not getting better. And
Okay.
so in the report, we have a chart that looks at a 100-year kind of period. And what you can see is over the last 50 years, you can see a steady growth of income going to the top 10% of earners. And so in 2022, we saw that the top 10% had about 45% of the income. And so that leaves less and less for the bottom 90%, right? So it's just this continued trend. And
Hmm.
like you said, it's going in the wrong direction. We'd like to see that better distributed so that people can access the goods and services that they need. And the other thing that we looked at in the report, and this is a component of that growing gap, is that workers' wages haven't kept up with productivity. And so
Yeah.
productivity has, I can look at more, I don't know how much listeners love the specific numbers, but kind of the general takeaway is that productivity has increased over a 25-year period by almost 50%, but workers' compensation has not increased that much. And if worker compensation had kept up with productivity gains, workers would be making $6,500 more a year. And so that's, I think, a really important part of this story.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Julie. One thing I found in the report that I would love some to hear your thoughts on is, and you kind of touched on it, but I just want to name it a little more directly, in that there is good news, such as median wages have gone up, and yet people are struggling. I guess I wonder, um, like, where is the money going if people are still struggling and yet productivity has gone up? Um, yeah, like I guess I'm still wondering why that contradiction is there.
Yeah, I think it's about the distribution, right?
Okay.
Right, like we can see, and we often hear these high level numbers of our economy is growing and doing well, but who is it doing well for? And so it's just the distribution of resources are going more and more to those top earners as opposed to being divided more evenly amongst all of the economy. And that doesn't mean like it needs to be that everyone is getting exactly the same amount, but that at the very least we keep up with the baseline from 20 years ago, right? That we don't see a growing gain or a growing gap, but also that we really just see people getting the resources for their work so they can make ends meet.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the charts that I think is particularly striking and is worth mentioning is that our minimum wage isn't keeping up with our livable wage in the state. And so what you can see in the specific chart is that for two full-time workers earning minimum wage, they can't access fair market rents in Vermont today. That two-person household, each earning minimum wage, fall about $25,000 short of the rent they would need to access that fair market rent. So I think this is a big piece of the story, is that our minimum wage, rents are increasing and making it more difficult for people, but wages aren't going up enough.
Mm-hmm. I think where I hear that story play out in my reporting is when I talk to employers and they say, I tried to recruit people from outside Vermont. They couldn't find housing for the longest time. When they did, it was more than they could afford or wanted to pay or whatever, and so they didn't take the job. I think that's the story I hear kind of playing out when, like I said, when I'm doing my reporting.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about housing prices, but I was really talking about home ownership values.
Mm-hmm.
It's this very similar story for renting, for folks who are renting, right? 3/4 of our rental units in 2024 were over $1,000 a month, and it was just under half in 2019 were of that value. So we're just like everything is shifting. All of these costs are shifting up, while incomes are not moving as quickly, and um, and the distribution means things are unaffordable, particularly to those at the lowest ends.
Mm-hmm. This So many decades have passed between when my mom was a single mom and looking for rents in Wilmington. But the first apartment she found in Wilmington was 2 bedroom, little apartment, absolute top floor of this old house. Um, but she paid 150 a month for it. Now, granted, that was late 70s, early 80s, and I realize that that's not the same. But could you imagine a single mom paying 150 for an apartment? Like,
Amazing.
no. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, it,
But the reality is that still is what is affordable to some folks with the lowest incomes, right? We generally think about you should be paying no more than 30% of your income towards housing. And um, single parents who need financial assistance and support from the state, they're getting about a family of four gets about $900 a month from the state. So those families can't afford much more than that and still make other ends meet.
that's a
So
very good point.
yeah, I do think we just really, I think it's helpful to have that 30% benchmark to kind of put things in context because yeah, 150 a month, that sounds great.
Mhm.
Sounds reasonable. Sounds livable.
It was doable at the time.
Right.
Definitely. We have a couple minutes before we need to hear from some underwriters here on WVEW. Any last minute thoughts or anything you want to share to kind of tie up this part of the conversation?
I think we've talked about costs and wages. Let me just peek at my notes. I think we're going to talk about some solutions when we come back. I could
Mhm.
just ground people a little bit in what's happening with the workforce, because we really did see this report as like kind of a where are we since the pandemic? And what we see is generally our workforce has caught back up to where we were before the pandemic. Our labor force participation across different age groups tends to be about where it was in 2019 and 2020. Um, One thing that is notable is that Vermont has not yet recovered all the jobs that that were lost during the pandemic. So
Mm.
we're one of 4 states that doesn't have as many jobs in kind of mid 2025 compared to the start of 2020. So that's something notable for us to continue to think on and look at and be paying attention to.
Yeah, that thank you for bringing that up. That stood out to me because I do hear from so many employers that they can't fill the jobs they have. And so I guess I'm wondering what's the disconnect? Are the jobs that have been lost, is there a disconnect between employees and skill sets and the jobs that were lost? Or like, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
This is such a good question, and I wish I had a really good answer for you. I have kind of a nerdy answer, which is like the data is just not good enough. Like we have a sense of, we can look a little bit at where industries have brought jobs back, and we know that accommodations and hospitality were really badly hit during the pandemic. And I need to go back, but I'm pretty sure those jobs have mostly come back. Um, but what we don't really have a good sense of is sort of what the jobs are that employers are having a hard time filling, and kind of this is where those Vermont data holes are that you spoke of at the beginning, right? Like we don't have as in-depth data in terms of which jobs are going unfilled. Are they not paying very well? Are they part-time? We do have some information on job openings, but we can't actually look at what the jobs are paying or if they're full or part-time work. So
Mm.
there's a number of different things that we as a data shop are really interested in continuing to explore. And so we're constantly trying to figure out other ways to get at this, but unfortunately we haven't cracked the nut yet. I will keep you posted though.
Oh, please do. Please do. Because I think you raise a good point that, an employer might have 6 job openings, but if they're all part-time and don't come with benefits, then that might be harder if the worker needs something else to
Yeah.
to make their
Yeah.
economic life work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the federal level, like we can say a little bit more nationally. I can't, but someone else can, right? Like the data is there to look a little bit more at like which industries in particular are struggling with the workforce. And I think if you talk to folks in Vermont, they, who are more familiar with specific sectors, they know just from experience around nursing, dental hygienists, things like that. But that is definitely a much more, it's not it's we can't drive that by the larger data, but more by the experiences in each of those fields.
Thank you. We are going to hear from some underwriters here on WVEW, LP Brattleboro, so stay tuned. Julie Lowell and I will return in a moment. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters. And if you're just joining me, I'm speaking with Julie Lowell from the Public Assets Institute, and she is the Economic Security Policy and Outreach Director. And we're walking through the State of Working Vermont 2025 report, where if you're just joining us in the first half of the show, we were looking at just some of the actual findings in the report, and now we're going to kind of look a little bit more towards the future about, okay, here's our economy, this is what we can do about it. Julie, just before we dive back into the conversation, I'm going to quickly thank BCTV for taking the video version of the show, sharing it with media centers around Vermont, and remind listeners that the views and opinions of those on the Montpelier Happy Hour belong to the host and the guests and no one else. So, you got a complaint, you can send it to the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com. So, thank you, Julie, for sharing all the findings in the State of Working Vermont report earlier in the show. I guess now, so like I said, we kind of know what the problem is. So now how do we move forward, especially in a time when things are so uncertain at the federal level?
Yeah. So one of the reasons that these problems are getting exacerbated is because we've had a pullback of investments in them from the federal government, right? A pullback or uncertainty. And, we talked about Medicaid and SNAP so much in the first half. But the same piece of legislation that has curtailed Medicaid and SNAP spending and benefits also extended large tax credits to the wealthiest in our country. And so I think it's really important to name this and look at what that means in Vermont. So what happened this summer in the reconciliation bill was there was an extension. They made permanent the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So they extended that, but they also expanded some of those tax cuts. And so what that means on face value in Vermont is that the richest 20% of Vermonters will see $700 million in tax savings each year. $700 million for just 20% of Vermonters in tax savings. And these are the richest Vermonters. So they are part of the, when we talked about the basic needs budget, they're in that group of families that are able to make ends meet, that are able to meet their basic expenses and then some. So we really think there's an opportunity here to recoup some of these dollars. And I think this is really important to talk about, right? That often you and I were talking earlier that public assets, we see our role as doing some myth busting. And so often we hear that taxes are the problem, taxes are the problem. And there are some fixes that we see in our tax code, particularly around property tax cuts or property taxes that would help those middle income earners. But we know that taxes can also be part of the solution, that some people in Vermont have ability to pay more, and that those increased progressive revenues can go to funding really important public programs that are good for individuals, they're good for families, and they're good for our whole community. And so we really like lawmakers to consider recouping those dollars. And so I'm happy to take your questions on that. There is a group called the Fair Share for Vermont campaign that's actively really working towards this goal. And so it's not just kind of a pie in the sky, we can recoup some of these dollars, but they have really specific policy proposals that would get at how we do this equitably in our state.
Mm-hmm. I do believe that, and I'm a little foggy on the year, but I seem to remember Representative Emily Kornheiser and maybe folks from Public Assets Institute talking about the Fair Share for Vermont campaign. Mm-hmm. And I was a little curious, did it just disappear? But it sounds like it's still active. And
it is still active. And I think this makes a lot of sense to people, right? We're asking people who are able to kind of to pay a little bit more, and actually not pay a little bit more, but pay what they were paying, and into a different source that will help their communities. And that a couple of years ago, there was some traction in the House around this proposal. And that proposal was a 3% surcharge on incomes over, I believe it was $500,000. And the way that passed out of the House was that it was tied to making housing investments, right? Such an important space, which we've already talked about at length, that is continuing to be more unaffordable for people. So I think it makes a lot of sense that this is a space where we can find more revenues to do really important public investments.
Mm-hmm. Talking about taxes, there's such a pressure point, I think, for so many people. And I wonder if you could walk us through, I'm not sure which page it's on in the report, but there is a page in the report where you talk about how I think middle income workers pay a bigger share of their income towards taxes than people in the upper tax bracket. Am I
Yeah,
remembering that correctly?
yeah. So it's kind of interesting, right, how these things stack together. Vermont has a really long history of a progressive income tax, right? It makes sense to people. You pay based on your ability. And so the higher your income is, the higher percent of your income that goes to taxes. So that's kind of the base, one of our anchors in our tax system. But then people pay sales and excise taxes and property taxes. And so when you just look at income tax, like we see this nice slope up. The more money you make, the more you pay in taxes, a higher percentage of your income. And that makes sense. That's that progressive income tax. But sales taxes tend to be regressive because um, you only usually consume so much, right? And if you have a lower income, if everyone's consuming the same amount of food and you have lower incomes, it's going to take up a larger portion of your income. So the sales tax and our property tax, they throw that nice slope that we see from the progressive income tax, they throw it out of whack. And what happens in practice is that middle income Vermonters are actually paying a larger share of their income overall to taxes than the highest earners. So there's some opportunity there to create a truly progressive system so that when you tax, so that when you stack on all of those, which you see in the chart there, when you stack all of those taxes together, right, that we really create a smooth line that doesn't go up and down, but continues to go up. So there's
Mm-hmm.
a real opportunity there. I think that there's other ways too that a lot of what we've been talking about is income taxes, but we haven't talked much in this report about wealth taxes, right? And we know that many people with high incomes also have a lot of wealth, and
Mm-hmm.
that is contributing to them to be able to have more income, to be able to access other resources. And so there's other opportunities for lawmakers to think about how do we tap into wealth as a way to improve revenues in the state and fund important public programs. One of the, one thing that people have been talking about is the second homes tax and what
Mm-hmm.
that looks like. So that is also a conversation happening in the building right now.
Mm-hmm. How would you just mentioned the sales tax as a regressive tax. How could you make the sales tax less regressive?
So one of the ways that um, we can do this is through refundable tax credits. And so we already do some of this in the state. So for families with children under the age of 6 and for low income workers, people are eligible for refundable tax credits. So regardless of once if how much taxes you owe, like if you right you get money back. So if you owe $500 in taxes and your refundable credit's $1,000, once that $500 bar was met, you'd get $500 back. So that's one way that you can offset some of these pieces for folks, and the state's actually done a really good job in the last few years um, expanding those affordable refundable credits. So we're pretty excited about that as a policy and can see some ways that we could expand that for more families. Like I said, I love talking about our child tax credit because it's a flat $1,000 credit, and it is now newly for families with 6-year-olds and under. Initially, it was just for 5-year-olds and under, but we know kids are still expensive all the way up to 18, and then some. So to see an expansion of that, I think could really go a long way to help families. And then we have a really nice mechanism in place where you can get flexible cash funding to families, right? Maybe lawmakers say we actually really need to increase that $1,000 or increase it specifically for families at the lower income ranges. Then we have like a nice system set up where we can get families flexible cash assistance where they can very efficiently move that money to whatever area they need it, whether it's the car repair, summer camps for the kids, credit card debt, like whatever these things are, helping pay off school loans. Families really kind of are the experts in their own budgets. And so this is a pretty exciting way that I could talk about refundable tax credits forever. So you all have to stop me. But I think the original question was, how do you counter the sales tax challenge?
Mm-hmm.
And that's one really important way.
A lot of attention gets paid to taxes as a policy lever, and I get that because that's one of the main policy levers a government has. But are there policies that the state house or the legislature could put into place that would help mitigate some of these other issues, particularly the wage to cost gap?
I think really addressing the minimum wage would be incredibly helpful. Um, and I think I already said this, but I've been talking about this report to a number of people, so just stop me. Right, that we're seeing that growing gap between the livable wage and the minimum wage. So could we tie those more closely together so that we're not seeing growth between those two numbers would be really important.
Mm-hmm.
And we do index our minimum wage to inflation, but inflation is a national number and it can we can look at it from a New England specific inflationary metric, but it's not Vermont specific. Whereas the benefit of tying it to something like the livable wage, which is, for those of you who don't know, is tied to the basic needs budget report that we talked about at length in the first half of the show. So um, that's much more Vermont specific than just an inflation index. So it, I think, does a better job of helping us understand um, how much people need to get by in Vermont and how much the cost of living has really increased.
Mm-hmm. I remember one year, uh, the State of Working Vermont might have been pre-pandemic, so it may have been 2018, 2019. So in the before times, um, this was very eye-opening for me. You actually did some looking at the whole, oh, Vermont's an expensive place to live, and our cost of living is so much higher than so many other places. And the Public Assets Institute actually compared our cost of living to the other New England states, and said that, for the most part, we were kind of like in the middle of the pack for cost of living, but our wages were at the bottom level of the pack. And I don't know if that's still true, but that was a real eye opener for me.
Yeah, that is a chart that we have reproduced over the years, right? And like you said, it shows our prices tend to be on average or around the average of the rest of the US. But yeah, our wages are continually lower. And there's a couple of reasons for that. A lot of states' wages tend to be lower because you have a few states who have some really, really high earners that kind of throw that wage picture off. But we also can see in the data that Vermonters are paid less for the same professions and occupations than in other states. And we have one of the larger gaps between prices and wages than other states. So that is a really helpful chart for us to think about and kind of interrogate what's happening in the
Mm-hmm.
state.
Thank you, Julie. Um, Bringing this back to policy and potential solutions, I have a devil's advocate question. And bear with me, I'm probably not going to ask it with a lot of grace. Um, but you were talking about taxes and the Fair Share for Vermont campaign, and saying that if we did tax the highest earners differently, we could take that money and put it to things like housing or food assistance or that type of thing. And I see the wisdom in that, but it also makes me ask, but what if we could build an economy where people didn't need food assistance and people didn't need housing assistance? Like, isn't that really wouldn't that be the stronger or better goal? Um, but so I just want to throw that out to you. Like, what would need to shift if that was really the goal we were working for?
Yeah, I love this question, Olga. Um, I I think it's such an important one, right? And one that we need like really in-depth community conversations about. And I do think um, having done a lot of direct service in my life with folks experiencing homelessness and folks living in domestic violence shelters, right? People are going to be at crisis in some point in their life, and we need those really secure safety net systems. But the goal is really to create um, an infrastructure of programs that create space for everyone to get their needs met. And that's going to look really different. And so, one of the ways I've thought about this in the past is that in order for everyone to have economic security throughout their lifetime, you need public investment in kind of four specific areas. Some is cash assistance, some is just recognizing that sometimes people cannot make ends meet and they're going to need more money. And right now, we could be doing a much better job of that through our Reach Up program, which helps families with young kids who are living in poverty. And we could be doing more with our tax credits. The next area is public investment. And there's just some things it makes sense for us to provide as a community, right? Think about firehouses, think about schools, think about libraries, right? Like it makes a lot of sense to have really good public resources there. And then what policies can we do to build, we can talk about as wealth or assets for people so that they have some flexibility to do what they want to do, so that they can say, oh goodness, I'd love to go back to school to become an acupuncturist. Maybe that's something I've been trying on lately, right? Um, but how can you do that if you don't have a little bit of wealth and asset building? And so like the baby bond policy, I think is really good um, example of how people are starting to think about this. And then finally, we need kind of these equitable economy. And so the right policies in that bucket to make sure that wages are fair um, and that um, and that people can access the workforce. And I think some of the investments we've done so far in ensuring that equitable economy kind of get to this question that you ask of like, it's not just investing in the safety net, but we have seen so far really exciting improvements from the childcare investments. We're just, it sounds as if we're growing the childcare spots, that workers are getting paid better. Um, and there was, what's really kind of cool to look at in the basic needs budget report is this is an area where the expense has actually gone down when you compare year over year reports because the state has done more there, which means that, and this is an area in particular that without some government intervention, the market wasn't going to fix this. Childcare just wasn't going to be affordable in kind of a free market system. So I think we need to like have these really in-depth conversations with the experts in these fields around like what's the right balance of creating that economy where everyone can get by and what are kind of the right checks and balances and levers that we pull and put in place so that works for everybody. And unfortunately, the kind of free market is just never going to make that happen on its own without the right sets of policies in place. That may have been like a bit too like large of an answer, but it's a big question.
Well, yes, it is because I think it points to a whole systems change on top of um, everything else. Well, I've always felt, and this is just my opinion or even curiosity point, that we talk about the free market, and I think there are places in the US where the free market will solve some of these issues, but I think one thing you need is competition. And Vermont is so small, we don't always have that competition. So it reduces the incentive of the free market to take new action or change. Just my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we're seeing that a lot in healthcare, right? Like I think that's a lot of the kind of common wisdom is we just don't have the competition to bring some of the prices down. And um, I think this is a really important public good that we need to be thinking about because I think, as I said earlier, it's really impacting all of us in so many different ways, from small businesses to be able to start up to people being able to pursue self-employment, right? Like there's just so many ways in which this is a challenge in
Mm-hmm.
Vermont right now and impacting all the other conversations, including the education conversation.
Yeah, I mean, in most cases, when I'm covering municipalities or schools and they say our costs have gone up, it's like healthcare and insurance, top of the list.
Yeah.
And it's been for several years now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And this is another great example of, we talked about this at the beginning, like having those data touch points to really explain it. Because I think I can remember taking my first job, right? And being like, oh, our healthcare budget, is in this small nonprofit, it's a real struggle. But the data has really shown that Vermont healthcare costs are above and beyond that of other states. And it continues to be a pressure point that we need to address as a state more concretely.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Julie. So we talked about some changes to the tax codes. Are there other policies that the Public Assets Institute is looking at right now, as far as what could change the economy, what could make working Vermont a little stronger?
Yeah, we have worked kind of with a number of different partner organizations over the years under those policies that fall under that broad umbrella of economic security, like I was talking about before. And I think one that's really important that we haven't talked about yet is paid family leave.
Mm.
there's been a push to create a universal paid family leave program in Vermont for a long time. And this makes sense for so many reasons, right? And without that universal system in place, families are just facing a crisis. If they get sick, if a loved one gets sick, and they're facing untenable choices of potentially losing their job versus going to be with their parent while they're sick or um, facing their end days, right? And just choices that we don't want people to have to make, and that are not good for individuals and for their businesses. So I think this is a really important part of the conversation, um, that would strengthen our economy, that would make work better for workers, that would really just provide better economic security for folks overall. So
Mhm.
that's one that definitely comes to mind.
And remind us quickly where Vermont is with that, because I think paid family leave is one of those things the legislature has been working on in fits and starts for so many years that it almost feels like, wait, don't we have this
Didn't we
already?
do that already?
Yeah. So yeah, just quickly remind people where we are with it.
Yeah, so we had can I remember? This is the good question. When I first started, right before the pandemic, we actually had a very strong universal paid leave bill that went through the House, I believe.
I believe so, yeah.
And I don't remember if it got passed through the Senate, but then COVID hit, and then no one remembered anything else. So you're right. We've had kind of some gains. Like Vermont has some pretty good baseline sick days that are provided to everybody. Like I think I'm not clear on all the details, but it's somewhere about 5 sick days that every Vermont worker is guaranteed. Um, but and then I think we had some gains last year around making sure that medical leave was available to everybody, but it wasn't paid medical leave. And
Mm,
so we have made some progress, but this paid piece is really important because if you don't guarantee that people are paid during their medical leave, many people, particularly lower income workers, are just not going to be able to take that medical leave, or going to have to be making some really difficult choices that folks with higher incomes might be able to weather a little bit better,
mhm.
if they're faced with those choices. The paid family medical leave campaign is still alive, and would love to see it really get some traction.
Mhm. Are there good resources that you could recommend if people wanted to dig into the issue a little bit more?
If you go to Voices for Vermont's children's website, they have often spearheaded this campaign, and they would have some of the more up to date resources than I can give you right now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And I'll listeners, I'll look that up and I'll put those in the show notes as well, along with Fair Share Vermont campaign, just in case you are curious and you want to dig into the information a little bit more. Um, so, wow, we have covered a lot of ground, Julie.
We have, yes.
And we have just a couple minutes left. I guess, what do you want to leave listeners with as they go forward? And everybody's probably looking at their household income right now going, oh. So I don't know, any thoughts, any resources? Yeah.
I think this is just a really important and great time to be in community as much as you can. Be talking about these things, be talking about them with your neighbors, reaching out to your lawmaker and sharing what your concerns are and what you would like to see happen in your state. I think this is, we all weathered a period, and these are really my own opinions at this point. This is not in the report, but we've really weathered so much isolation during the pandemic. And we
Mm,
might have to rebuild that muscle a little bit of how to. I think a lot of us are starting to already, but just a reminder, keep doing what you're doing. It's really good for all of us, and it's really important for us to build that Vermont where everyone can make ends meet, um, in order to be in conversation with each other and come up with solutions together.
thank you very much. Julie Lowell, Economic Security Policy and Outreach Director for the Public Assets Institute. Um, where can people find more of the Public Assets Institute's work?
Yeah, publicassets.org has a lot of information. You can get lost in our charts there for as long as you'd like. The current report is up already. We also do a monthly snapshot of economic indicators, which sometimes people find really helpful. And it's just um, is much shorter than the report. It's usually one or two data pieces that just keep you grounded in what's happening in the economy in Vermont. And so you can get information on that in the report. You can always sign up for updates. But that's probably the best place. And you can also find us on social media.
And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW LP Brattleboro every Friday at 2 p.m., rebroadcasted on Wednesday mornings on BCTV, and of course, wherever you subscribe to your podcasts. Take care, everyone. Have a great weekend.